Martin Turner here. This week, Maria Tyler leads the lecture as we focus on capital expenditure decisions. We look at three methods for evaluating capital investments: the payback period, net present value, and internal rate of return. First, Maria Tyler sets the scene by asking what we think capital is and what factors we might consider when deciding to buy a new car or new house.
And today we're literally just going to be going through the three capital investment techniques that you will need to know. Well, you actually have to calculate them, and we'll mark you on that in step 9 of your assignment 2. And we'll finish off with the minute paper. So I'm not going to repeat anything that's, well, I'll try not to repeat too much, anything that's already in my step-by-step video guide on Moodle. So if I just get out of this, I'll remind you that there is a separate video. Make sure that you toggle your little blocks on so you can see the blocks on the right-hand side of Moodle. Under videos, it's the very last one. Ignore the bottom two right down the bottom. These are just blanks. It's this capital budgeting. Okay, so now there is one sort of discrepancy in here to the new study guide, because when I record these videos, I do them Christmas time at the end of each year, and usually Martin's writing the study guide for the next year at that same time. So the weighted average cost of capital that I refer to in this video is 10%. In Martin's study guide, it's 8%. So, and I'll touch on that shortly as I go through the lecture. Okay, so first interactive question. So I hope everybody's on the slides now. I want to know what you think capital is, all right, because we are talking about investing capital and some techniques to evaluate where to invest our capital. Okay, so what is capital budgeting? You'll hear the terms capital investment decisions, capital budgeting, investment appraisal. They're all terms that refer to the same thing. So what is capital? What do you think capital is? All right, so can you please go to the next slide? And there's a little nice box here you can fill in with your response for me. What do you think capital is? I'll give you a minute or so to pop your answers down. It doesn't matter, there's no right or wrong answer, this is just your opinion. Everybody has a different view of what capital is, and it generally refers to, we all sort of think about it conceptually similarly, but we have unique perspectives. I've got a few submissions coming in. This is good. Keep them coming in. So capital is both assets and equity, financial assets such as money. Another student thinks that capital is a form of asset that can only be funded to one item at a time. Now, this is an interesting concept, actually, and I will pick up on that towards the end of today's lecture. All right, so a form of asset that can only be funded to one at a time. This has got a few key concepts in there, so that's a good comment, and I will refer back to that one. Capital budgeting is the cash made from financial assets. When the owner invests assets into the business, capital is assets a business can invest in. So you can already see everybody's got a very similar conceptual idea of what capital is. So in the business world, we generally talk about capital as referring to some form of wealth, such as money or other assets, as has been said here, financial assets such as money. So we refer to capital as some sort of wealth, like the money and the assets that have been listed here, that we use for starting a business or investing in something to make more money. So well done, they were very good responses. So while you're on a roll, I've got another interactive question for you. So this is your next one. You'll have to pop in an answer for me. When you decide to buy a new car or a new house, What factors do you consider and why do you consider those factors? Okay, so you probably spend a bit of time searching and comparing between different options, because buying a new car or a house can often involve spending a large amount of money, so you want to make sure you're getting value for your money. So what sort of factors do you think about and why when you're thinking to buy a new car or a new house? So I'll give you another minute or so to pop your responses in there. Okay, what sort of factors do you consider when you're buying a new car or a new house, and why? So let's have a look. We've got a few responses in now. When I look at buying a car, I look at the power figure, the weight of the car, oh that's interesting, the fuel economy, the shape of the body, the overall size and dimensions, the interior features, the ergonomics, fuel economy, how much repayments will be, how much interest I will be paying, registration costs for that model, and insurance costs. I look at these factors to try and find the best car that suits my needs. That is an excellent response, really good. You've identified exactly what you consider and why. And the key words in there is that suits my needs. Okay, and I'm going to pick up on that in the next slide, actually. That's a key concept with our capital investment decisions, that suits my needs. So next one, location, price, and cost effectiveness, rates or fuel. So again, looking at future maintenance costs or expenses. Loan fees, interest rates, ongoing costs such as rates or car servicing, tyres. Will I be able to afford the continued cost? For example, if I bought a full drive, could I afford $1,600 each time they need to be replaced? Exactly. Here's one about a house. So when I bought my house, I considered the mortgage payment and the interest rate percentage. I also considered the location and whether the house met my needs. So again, meeting needs. So that it's aligning to your personal requirements. This is very good. The possible damage taxes that may occur on any part of the car or house to ensure that the property can be restored if a possible accident occurs. This is an interesting concept. I don't think that's been mentioned yet. For the house, I will look at its efficiency and any taxes that come with the house. So again, still referring to costs, maintenance costs. The condition of the investment and also whether it's viable and I'm able to pay it off. It depends if you have to factor if you're going to be on finance or pay the full sum up front, as well as competitive prices from different companies and the location of the house, because that will determine the price. Am I making the best deal? Can I look after a more expensive car or house in the long term? What will I be able to afford what I want? Will I be able to afford what I want? Again, this is a really good comment there. So again, coming back to your personal requirements and your personal ability to fund those requirements. How much will the insurance cost for the car? The fuel economy? Will I be able to afford the mortgage on the house? Very good. Some factors to consider are model, location, the size of the loan from the bank, the energy efficiency and reliability. All these factors are considered because we want the product that best suits our needs and that will last. Very good. So all of those responses, oh, here's another one. How much money will you need to back the investment? How long will it take for you to pay the money back? Oh, this is getting onto some of our techniques now. We calculate a payback period, you know. Whether you're getting good value for money, fuel economy, the price for registration. So this actually was it sums up what I was just about to say, which is all of these responses here have really said you want to consider all of these factors because you're spending a large amount of money that may be ongoing in the future, and you want to make sure you are getting value for your money. Every single response has been surrounded by the concept of getting this good value for your money. You know, the size of the car, whether the car's a four-wheel drive or a two-wheel drive, so it suits driving in certain conditions. So again, your own needs. I'm going to pick up on that in the next slide. The insurance, the location of the house, and so forth. So that's fantastic. Thanks for those responses. You're helping me with this lecture, actually. So you guys want to make sure that you're getting value for your money, and businesses are exactly the same. Okay, they need to make sure they're going to get value for investing their money in business assets. So usually for businesses, capital budgeting involves comparing potential projects which are long-term. They involve large sums of money, and they are very difficult to reverse or get out of. Okay, now I told you I was going to pick up on some of those comments. There's no point applying any of the techniques that we're going to go through today if your investment doesn't align with your overall business strategy. Okay, this is a very important point, this last one here. Where does that investment fit in with your long-term business goals? A couple of you mentioned in your responses here, it needs to suit my needs. I want the house to meet my needs. Will I be able to afford something that I want? So does it align with your business goals, with your long-term business goals? There's no point even evaluating the purchase of a sports car now if you know you're going to need a family car soon, right? So you make sure that your investment aligns with your strategic plan as a business. That's a very important point. There's no point even evaluating techniques if it doesn't align with our needs going forward. Okay, so let's just assume we've got potential investments that align with our business needs, with our personal needs. Businesses generally agree on some basic criteria that are considered to be good decision criteria, okay? And so here they are. These are sort of just the very basic general good decision criteria. So are all the cash flows considered? Is it risk adjusted? Have we adjusted for risk? Is there an ability to rank the projects that we're looking at? Does it indicate any added value to the firm? Okay, and you'll see that we refer back to those when we discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each technique as we go through today. Now, based on these good decision criteria, businesses have developed a number of tools and techniques that can be used to evaluate the different investments, and that's what is known as the capital budgeting or capital investment techniques. And we're going to go through 3 of those today, okay? So we can have a quick look at each of the methods now. So these are the 3 methods that you'll have to cover for assignment 2. And remember, you have the video presentation of me taking you through the step-by-step process of working each of these out in Excel. And they don't take very long to do in Excel because Excel has formulas for 2 of them, and I'll show you how to do the cumulative cash flow method for the payback period in Excel. So I'm not going to repeat that today. What I am going to do is provide you with an explanation behind each of these 3 methods, because as the next step after you calculate them in your assignment, you have to explain each of your calculations and then come to a decision. Okay, so we'll go through each of these methods now. So payback period, it's probably the easiest concept to think about because you literally just have to say, how long will it be until I get paid back for my initial investment? Okay, so generally you want a shorter payback period. People like to get paid back sooner rather than later. So the sooner you get paid back, the less risk you are taking on with the investment. Okay, so the shorter the better with this technique. And we're going to go through how do I calculate it in the example. And I'll just cover the concepts. So we estimate the cash flows and subtract it and so forth. But remember, I show you how to do that in Excel in the video on Moodle. So let's have a look at an example for payback. All right, so how long until I get paid back for my investment? So we're going to assume in this scenario that we invest $5,000 and that returns us nice and neat actually, a $200 per year return, okay? If we were to divide, so this is the formula is the investment amount divided by the investment return. So if we were to divide our $5,000 investment by the $200 per year, it would take us 25 years to get paid back for our investment. So if we invested $5,000 a year and it returned us $2,000 per year, then it would only take us 2.5 years to get paid back for our investment. So you can see how that formula works. All right, so the higher your return is, the sooner you get paid back. Now, the problem with this nice formula is that most investments don't return you a nice even cash flow. So you actually have to calculate this manually, okay, using what we call the cumulative cash flow method. So this is more like what you would have to create for your assignment, like what you will have to create for your assignment in step 9. Okay, so if the investment has cost us $100,000 and we've got estimated cash flows of $15,000 a year for the first 3 years and then $30,000 a year for the next 2 years, what is the payback period? So this is the logic that you have to work through. So you say year 0, which is right now, we have got negative $100,000 cash flow, CF standing for cash flow. Okay, so right now we are putting in, so negative cash flow out, $100,000. At the end of year 1, we get $15,000. At the end of year 2, we get $15,000. At the end of year 3, we get $15,000. So you can see the $15,000 return coming in. Then at the end of year 4, and year 5, we get $30,000, and we probably can keep putting cash flows in there, but we don't need to because we sort of get paid back around here. So I'll pick up on that later. So at the end of year 1, we've got the negative $100,000 from year 0, which was when we first invested, plus our first $15,000. So we're at negative $85,000 to recoup. At the end of year 2, we get another $15,000, so we're at negative $70,000 to recoup. At the end of year 3, we get a further 15, so now we've got $55,000 to recoup. At the end of year 4, we get $30,000 in, so now we've only got $25,000 to recoup. In year 5, we don't just get $25,000, we actually get $30,000, so we get more than what we need to recoup our initial investment. So we're actually onto a positive at the end of year 5. So we know that we get paid back somewhere in year 5. Okay, so not in year 4, because at the end of year 4 we've still got $25,000 to be recouped, but somewhere in year 5 we actually get paid back. And you can actually calculate a part year payback period by dividing the needed cash flow to break even, which is the $25,000. That's what we need to break even or recoup our initial investment. You divide that out of the total cash flow that you get for that year, which is the $30,000. Okay, and then just multiply that by 365 days if you want the answer in days, or 12 months if you want the answer in months, or just leave it as a decimal if you want the answer in years. Okay, so 25,000 divided by 30,000, that would be your part year payment. A better way to calculate this, so I put it this way, so that's to explain the logic behind what we're thinking, but to show it as a calculation, and it's a better way to calculate it, is to actually list out what we call the cumulative cash flow. And this is how I show you to do it in the assignment. So we list up the top, the first row is the years, so times 0 right now when we invest, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and so forth. As long as you make your scenario, we ask you to do 10 years in the assignment, so between 5 to 10 years. Then the first row underneath that is just the cash flow. So that was the negative $100,000 when we first invested, the $15,000 for each of the first 3 years, and then $30,000 for the next 2 years. And I've put an additional one on to show that there was another $30,000 after that as well. Okay, so we had $100,000, and then negative 100 because that's what we invested into the investment, then every other year it's positive because now our investment is returning us a cash flow. Now, to calculate the cumulative cash flow, meaning it counts the year before, we start with times 0. So we have 100,000 when we first invest. At the end of year 1, we're up to negative 85 to recoup. At the end of year 2, we're up to 70. At the end of year 3, 55. At the end of year 4, 25,000 to recoup. Then in year 5, we start turning positive. Okay, we only had 25,000 to recoup. We actually got 30,000. So we're now starting in positive territory, okay, to add value and so forth. So to calculate the part years, remember you simply take whatever cash flow you need to break even. We need the 25,000 to break even, and ignore the negative because it makes no bearing on this calculation. So we just need $25,000 to break even out of what we're getting, which is the 30,000. So 25,000 divided by the 30,000 and multiply it by 365 days if you want your answer in days. So that gives you 304 days. So the payback period in days will be 4 years and 304 days. If you want your answer in months, multiply that by 12. So 9.99 is the decimal portion. So the payback period will be 4 years and round it to say 10 months. And then if you just want your answers in years, leave the decimal. So 25 out of the 30 is 0.83. So make sure you add your 4 years to the decimal. So payback period is 4.83 years. Okay. Now, do we accept or reject the project? Well, this depends as well. And you're going to have to set your own acceptable limit in your scenario that you create for your assignment. Whether you accept or reject it depends on your company's determined or acceptable levels for payback period. So if your company said our acceptable payback period for investment projects is 5 years, then in this case, because you get paid back within 5 years, you would accept the project. If your company said our acceptable payback period is 3 years, then you wouldn't accept this project because it takes longer than 3 years to be paid back. All right, so whether you accept or reject the project, the decision criterion depends on what your company's acceptable payback period criteria is. Okay, so like I said, if it was 5 years, you would accept it. If it was 3 years, you wouldn't accept it. Okay, so that's payback period. So some advantages and disadvantages of it. The advantages, obviously, it's very easy to understand. And it's also biased towards liquidity. Liquidity meaning how quickly you can turn something to cash. Okay, because it focuses on cash flow. So, but there are a number of disadvantages, and they're fairly large disadvantages when you think about it. Firstly, it ignores the time value of money, the concept that $1 today is actually worth more than $1 tomorrow. You notice we didn't discount any of these rates to present value. We just assumed $30,000 in 5 years is the same as $30,000 today, which really isn't the case. Okay, so it ignores that time value of money. It also requires that arbitrary cutoff point. As soon as you get paid back, you ignore all the cash flows after that. Okay, you ignore everything beyond that cutoff date. So remember when we were calculating cash flows, even though I indicated there was future inflows here, we ignored that. Not once did that factor into our calculation down here. We stopped once we got to year 4.83 and we ignored everything after that. So we ignored the 5,000 from this year and the 30,000. And that's a disadvantage because it's not taking into account the extra value that's being added beyond the payback period. So there are a number of disadvantages of that. But like I said, it is easy to understand, and a lot of people do like it because they like to know how quickly they can recoup that initial investment. So it still provides a little piece of the larger puzzle. And all of these tools are little pieces in the big picture puzzle. Now, net present value. I said before, just then, that payback period doesn't take into account this time value of money, and that's one of its limitations. Well, net present value is considered to be the best investment appraisal technique because it considers all cash flows and it accounts for that time value of money, that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow because I can invest my $1 today and get more with that $1 tomorrow. Okay, so the time value of money is very important. Now, net present value brings each of those future cash flows from an investment back to their value in today's dollars, and we call that present value, okay? That's a process that is known as discounting. When you discount your cash flows, you are recognizing that $30,000 in 5 years' time is actually different to $30,000 today. Okay, $30,000 today is worth more than what it will be in 5 years' time, because we can invest that now and get more in the future. So, for example, with this one, the formula for net present value is we bring all of those future cash flows to a present value. Okay, so we discount all of the future cash flows and we add them all up, all of their present values. And then we take off the initial cost or the initial investment amount. So in this example, the initial investment is $5,000. It's going to return us $200 per year for 5 years. Now, just on those figures alone, you can see this wouldn't be a very good investment. Well, let's ignore that fact for now. What we need to do if we are using the net present value method is to discount the $200 each year for the 5 years back to their value in today's terms. Okay, so the $200 in 1 year's time, what is it worth today? It's worth $187. The $200 that we get in year 2, what is it worth in today's? $175. In year 3, $200 is worth $163 today. In year 4, it's worth $153, and the $200 in year 5 is worth $143 in today's present value. Okay, so we discount each of these 5 years of $200 back to their values in today's world. We call that the present value. Okay, so we're discounting them, and we're discounting them, or we're bringing them back to today's value using this discount rate. Now, this is a huge area for manipulation, and I'll talk about that soon. But for now, let's just assume it's 7%. Okay, so we're discounting $200 by 7% to today's value, present value. So we discount all of the future cash flows into their present value, and then we add them up. So we add 187 plus 175 plus 163 plus 153 plus 143. We add them all up, and that gives us $821. That's the present value of those future cash flows. That's this first section in the formula. So the present value of $200 for 5 years in the future is $821 in today's present value. We then have to take off the initial investment from the $821 of $5,000. So $821 minus $5,000 gives a net present value of negative $4,179. Okay, so obviously it's negative, which means it's going to lose you money. The decision rule is if you get a positive net present value, accept it because it will return you value. If it's negative, don't proceed because it's going to lose your value. And we would have known that just on those figures, but we went through the motions for the purpose of the example. So negative present value, we wouldn't accept this one. Now, I'm just going to mention about this discount rate, okay? Now, we can discount a cash flow back to today's dollars using any discount rate that you want. You can choose any rate that you want. Remember, in my video, I use 10%, and Martin says use 8%. Okay, that's a discount rate. And really, if you find that your own company has a weighted average cost of capital and you want to use that as the discount rate, that's fine too. You just justify it in your Word document. You can use any discount rate that you want as long as you justify it, okay? We just like you to think about these things. But you should be aware that the higher the discount rate that you use, the lower your net present value will be. And that's because you're requiring a higher return. If you require a higher return, then you're going to lower that net present value. All right, if you require just a small return, then your net present value will be higher. Okay, so remember, the higher this discount rate that you use, the lower your net present value will be, and vice versa. So there's an inverse relationship between discount rate and net present value. So you can see that there's room for manipulation with this technique. And in practice, to avoid that area of manipulation, companies will actually they'll often set a discount rate that they'll use across all of their investments or their investment classes, okay? So the example that I give with that in practice is, this is going back probably 2011 now, a number of years ago. I was working with one of the mines out west of Mackay on capital investments, and so they had, the company back then was Xstrata, doesn't exist anymore, and they had some funding available for capital investments across their mines. So they said to all of the mines, can you submit what you would like for capital investments for your mines? Can you submit it to head office? And we will look through all of those investments and we will decide which ones we give the funding to. Now, they mandated that they use a discount rate if they're using, because they required net present value for these investments. They mandated a set discount rate because they were aware previously when submissions were submitted to them, they were aware that managers from different mines were choosing a lower discount rate so that their net present value of these investments would look really good. So they realised they weren't being able to compare apples with apples. So they mandated and they said, if you submit your, well, one of the criteria was you must submit a net present value for your capital investment proposal to us. And you must use, I can't remember what it was, about 9%, I suppose. You must use this set discount rate if you are calculating your net present value. So then they knew all of the capital proposals coming in from all the different mines around wherever they were for Xstrata at the time, they were actually being able to use that same discount rate, so they couldn't manipulate that net present value and make their project look better with a higher net present value. Okay, so just be aware that's a huge factor. The discount rate affects the net present value. The higher the discount rate, the lower your net present value, and vice versa. Okay, so let's move on. So net present value tells us how much value is going to be created from an investment. And here are the steps that you can follow to calculate net present value, and also the scary looking mathematical formula behind it. Now, don't worry, don't freak out if you're not into maths, okay? We get to use Excel in our assignment. But just for the maths nerds out there, the business finance behind it is explained on the next two slides. All right, so if you are interested, and only because I used to teach business finance, and this is what we go through. So if you have to do the unit business finance, you will have to know this scary looking mathematical formula anyway. So the sum of the present value of the future cash flows, essentially, minus the initial investment. That's what the formula takes you through. So I won't go through the next two slides, but it is there for all the maths gurus who like to see how it's actually calculated with the scary looking formula. Okay, and how we actually, so this is the scary looking formula in practice with all of the different mathematical symbols. So again, if you're interested, it's there and you can work through it, but we don't need to for our unit. We get to use Excel. Love Excel. So in Excel, there is an actual formula to calculate net present value. Literally, it's equals NPV, open bracket, and then fill in all your inputs, close bracket, hit enter. It's so good. And you use your discount rate as well as your forecasted cash flows, which is something you make up in your scenario that we ask you to do for step 9 in the assignment. And remember, I show you how to do that in Excel in that video presentation on Moodle called Capital Budgeting 2020. Okay, and don't forget your decision rule. If the net present value is positive, it's going to add value to your business, so accept the project. So when you are evaluating this as part of your assignment in the Word document, make sure that you are referring to the decision rule. So if we're to evaluate net present value, it meets all desirable criteria. It considers all of the future cash flows. It adjusts for risk. You can rank mutually exclusive projects. And a word on mutually exclusive projects, it was one of the responses actually that was picked up in the very first answer to your interactive questions. I will pick up on that at the end of the lecture. Mutually exclusive projects. There's a directly related, so net present value is directly related to an increase in wealth. So it's considered to be the dominant method in practice. Most firms will refer to the net present value method for capital investment. And if you're involved with any sorts of capital investment in the future in your work, I can almost guarantee you will be calculating this, or you will have to evaluate that and provide decisions and judgments and analysis surrounding it as to why. Now, you can also use net present value for your own investments, your personal investments. So you can start putting this into practice right away. All right, so that's net present value. That's the second method that you have to do for the assignment. The third method is very closely tied to net present value, because once you understand net present value and how that discount rate affects net present value, you will understand IRR, internal rate of return, because internal rate of return is simply the discount rate to get a break-even net present value. That is, when net present value equals zero, okay? So that discount rate when net present value equals zero, the discount rate we've been talking about, that's the internal rate of return. So break-even net present value, discount rate is internal rate of return, okay? So I'll say that again. Internal rate of return is simply the discount rate to get that break-even net present value. And it's the most important alternative to net present value that's widely used in practice. All right, it's based entirely on the estimated cash flows of the investment. That's internal rate of return. So if we have a look at the original example that we went through, you'll see that internal rate of return usually aligns with net present value. And I say usually because there's a couple of anomalies, which I'll cover soon. So again, the higher your net present value, the higher your internal rate of return will be. And the decision rule is that you should only accept investments that have an internal rate of return greater than whatever your required rate of return is for your company. Okay, so remember, internal rate of return is the discount rate when net present value is zero. So if we take the previous example, the original one that we looked at, the investing $5,000 and returning $200 for 5 years, and we try to find the internal rate of return that will make the net present value equal to zero. So what is the discount rate? That's what we're trying to find. That's the internal rate of return when net present value is zero. You'll find that we actually get a negative internal rate of return of 37%. So obviously we wouldn't proceed with that investment. Okay, and we knew that it was going to be terrible because when we calculated the net present value, it was also negative by a huge amount. So usually your internal rate of return will align with your net present value. Okay, now again, for the maths people out there, there's to actually calculate the internal rate of return manually, you have to use that scary looking mathematical formula. Okay, so there is no manual formula for internal rate of return. To manually calculate it, you have to keep calculating using that scary net present value formula we looked at before, and change that rate of return each time to try and get your net present value as close to zero as possible. Remembering that the higher your discount rate is, the lower your net present value is. So you just have to keep going high and high and high until you get to the point where your net present value is as close to zero as possible. Okay, so there's no manual formula. It's calculated manually using an iterative method of the net present value formula, that mathematical formula. If you're using a calculator, most financial calculators will have an internal rate of return button or formula method that you can use for your calculator. And so usually you will enter your cash flows like you would for a net present value calculation. Then you will press the IRR button or the IRR function. Some calculators have that little function button first and then press IRR and then compute or equals or enter, whatever your calculator has. So you can also calculate internal rate of return using a financial calculator. But the easiest way to do it, because most of us have Excel, is just to use Excel, okay? So in Excel, there's an actual formula that you use to calculate internal rate of return. It equals IRR, open bracket, fill in your inputs, close bracket, hit enter. And I show you how to do this in Excel in the video presentations on Moodle using your forecasted cash flows that you create for your capital investment scenario, okay? And don't forget your decision rules. So if the internal rate of return is greater than your company's required rate of return, then accept it. If it's lower than your company's required rate of return, then reject the project. Okay, now you also, for your assignment, you will make up that required rate of return. So you will say, okay, my company will accept 12% or higher, an internal rate of return of 12% or higher. So if your internal rate of return comes out at higher than 12%, so in our case, let's say 16.13%, then we would accept the project. If the internal rate of return comes out at 8%, that's lower than 12%, then don't accept the project. So you will make, like payback period, if it's within our acceptable limits, we'll accept it. If it's not, then we reject the project. So again, that's your decision rule. So I'll put this on the next slide because that's important. So the decision rule is you only accept investments that have an internal rate of return greater than your required rate of return, and you make that up for your scenario in your company. So there's a number of advantages and disadvantages of IRR as well. So of course, it's intuitively appealing. Okay, we understand rates of returns. Rates of returns seem to be quite a common understanding in our society, probably because we all talk about term deposits and interest rates so often. And so we understand what a rate of return is. You know, how much interest am I going to get on my money in the bank? That's a rate of return. So it's preferred by executives because it's easy to communicate a value of a project using a percentage. You know, the higher the percentage, the better the return is. We all understand that. It's intuitively appealing, we call it. So it's preferred by some of the managers. It considers all of your cash flows. It also considers the time value of money, that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. It is that discount rate. Internal return is that discount rate when you bring all of your cash flows to zero. Now, these, I said before I would come back to the mutually exclusive and internal rate of return usually aligns with net present value apart from a couple of areas. These are them. So internal rate of return can produce multiple answers in certain scenarios. And if you were to actually graph the internal rate of return mathematically, you will see it can cross the x-axis, so the horizontal axis, a number of times. Every time it crosses, that's an answer for internal rate of return. So it can produce multiple answers. Okay, so some of the disadvantages one of the disadvantages is it can cross that axis more than once. So it can produce multiple answers. And it can't rank mutually exclusive projects. I've mentioned I would come back to this one. So here we are, we're at that point in the lecture, near the end of the lecture, where I'm covering what mutually exclusive projects are. So a word on independent versus mutually exclusive projects is an independent project is the cash flows of one project are unaffected by the acceptance of the other, okay? Which means we can accept any project that we like. Mutually exclusive projects means we only can accept one. The acceptance of one project precludes or stops the acceptance of another. Now, one of the students mentioned in their answers to the interactive questions at the beginning of the lecture that capital is being able to invest only in one project and not in another. Okay, so that was a good concept. That was picked up right at the beginning of the lecture. This is where it comes in. That's referred to as being mutually exclusive. Okay, the acceptance of one project precludes acceptance of any other project. That's when mutually exclusive projects exist. So, for example, independent projects could be, you know, replacing a computer system and opening a store. The cash flows of each don't affect the decision of the other one. We can invest in any number of projects that we like. If they're all going to create us value, let's invest in all of them. Okay, it doesn't matter. Whereas a mutually exclusive project might be as simple as choosing a new photocopier for the office. All right, you only have the funds to invest in one photocopier for your office. So accepting a Konica Minolta might mean you can't accept the Xerox. Okay, so accepting one means you can't accept the other. And many business decisions, or most business decisions, are mutually exclusive because we don't have an unlimited bucket of funds. So many business projects are mutually exclusive, okay? So that's all about mutually exclusive projects. Now, sometimes you can get conflicting results for mutually exclusive projects with internal rate of return. And that's because the calculation of the internal rate of return relies on the timing as well as the pattern of cash flows. And it doesn't relay the impact of decreasing cash flows over time, as demonstrated in this little example. Okay, so project A and project B are mutually exclusive. So if we choose project A, we can't choose project B and vice versa. Okay. Now, if you look at the figures here in the example, project A has a larger cash outlay than project B does. It needs $500 instead of $400, and it returns us even cash flows over 2 years, whilst project B requires that lower initial outlay, but it returns us decreasing cash flows over 2 years. All right. Now, that iterative calculation for IRR, it doesn't adequately relay the fact that we have decreasing cash flows in project B. It has reported a higher internal rate of return than project B. So if you just went off internal rate of return, you would choose project B as the acceptable project to invest in. However, when you calculate net present value, you can see that project A actually results in higher value creation. So it's the better investment. So although both investments have positive net present value, and so the decision rule would be you would accept both projects, these projects are mutually exclusive, so we can only choose one. And based on net present value, that should be project A. So just be aware that internal rate of return is unreliable as a tool when it's used in mutually exclusive projects, and that's because it only relies on the timing and the pattern of cash flows. Was that a question? Sorry. All right, keep going. Okay, so to reiterate then, net present value directly measures the increase in value to the firm. Whenever there's a conflict between net present value and another decision rule, such as internal rate of return, always use net present value. It's the dominant method, okay? It's the most widely used method in practice. Internal rate of return is unreliable in these following situations: when you have non-conventional cash flows, when you have mutually exclusive projects, all right? Okay, so in practice, just remember that you should consider all of the investment criteria when you make decisions, all right? Net present value and internal rate of return are the most commonly used primary investment criteria. Payback is a commonly used secondary investment criteria, and there are a number of other tools for capital investment appraisal that you will learn about in other units as you progress through your degrees, or that you're doing in work right now. Okay, there's accounting rates of return that take into account profit, not just cash flows, and there's so many other tools that you can use to evaluate which projects or which investments you should put your capital into. Okay, and the thing to remember is you should consider as many criteria as possible when making your decisions, because they all provide valuable information. I like to think of them as little pieces in the big picture. The big jigsaw puzzle picture requires every little individual piece, and it tells you a tiny little bit of information, but it all contributes to that overall decision, okay, which is the best decision for our big picture investment. Okay, so always consider all investment criteria when you make decisions, because it will give you valuable information and a better base for your decision. So as you prepare for your minute paper shortly, that's me done for today, it's your turn now, think about the three methods that we've briefly considered through today, how you might be able to use them in the capital decisions that you might have to make in your personal life. And just remember, in practice, the hardest part is actually getting those estimations right. So the hardest part that I found in practice is actually estimating accurately the future cash flows. And you have to create a scenario for your step 9, right? You will have to estimate future cash flows or create a scenario for your company. But if you're doing it for personal investments, you're looking at an investment, How do you invest? How do you accurately as possible, estimate those future cash flows that you're basing your decision on? And that's the hardest part actually that I found in practice. Even things, for example, as buying a business, when you're estimating the future cash flows or the future profits of the business to try and bring that back to a value that the business might be worth you paying for it, how do you actually get that right? Because none of us have a crystal ball to get those future cash flows right. If we all had crystal balls, then a lot of us would be a lot richer than what we are. So the hardest part in practice is actually getting all of those estimating of the future figures correct. So here's a summary of what we did today as you prepare for your minute paper soon. So payback period, remember, is the length of time until the initial investment is recovered. You accept it if the payback period is less than some specified target. It doesn't account for the time value of money. It ignores cash flows after that payback period, and it requires that arbitrary cutoff period, and then we ignore everything after that. Net present value is the difference between the present value of future cash flows, what we call the market value, and the cost or the initial outlay. You accept it if net present value is greater than 0. So if it's going to return you value and it's positive, you accept it. There are no serious flaws to this decision criterion, so it's considered the preferred or dominant decision criterion. Internal rate of return is that discount rate that makes net present value 0. You accept it if the internal rate of return is greater than whatever your company's required rate of return is. It usually results in the same decision as net present value with conventional cash flows, but it can be unreliable in these two scenarios as I showed briefly in the example. So non-conventional cash flows such as decreasing cash flows and mutually exclusive projects. Okay, so here's your minute paper now. So two things if you can fill it in. What was the most important thing that you learnt today? And we'll have a look at some insights from you. I like to read lots of things about, in the past, students have said things like how they might be able to, apply this to their personal investments. And then also what questions still remain unanswered. And I'll do my best to answer those for you today. We have got a lot of time, so we shouldn't run out of time today. So I'll give you a minute, check on my phone, and I will come back and discuss your responses then. All right, I'll start going through some of the most important things that you learned today. Step 9 will be a doozy. Step 9 actually isn't worth that many marks. I'm just going to go to the assessment criteria for you. I'll go to assignments. I was going through this with my Mackay students in the tutorial last week, actually. We sort of, in the tutorials, I try and get them a week ahead just to make sure, they get that move on to get their assignments in. So we covered step 9 actually last week in the tutorial, but I was pointing out to them, hey, step 9 will be a doozy. It probably won't be a doozy. You'll probably find it's really easy. Okay, so this is step 9, explained to you in the assignment in like half a page, literally. And you can see that Martin suggests you should only spend between 2 to 2.5 hours to complete this step. So it's not much longer than this lecture today, really. This lecture's what, 1.5 hours? So if you spend about that same amount of time with completing it, then you're done. So it's not really a doozy. Compare that to step 8, which is your ratios, right? Which is suggested to be about 9 to 10 hours. So I don't think step 9 is really going to be a doozy, to be honest. Step 9 is actually only worth 5 marks. It's 3 marks for your calculations, like 1 each for literally for net present value, payback period, and internal rate of return. You get 1 mark for creating your scenario, and you get 1 mark for evaluating your responses. So that's your 5 marks. So just always break down your steps in light of what's actually required, the time that might be involved, and the actual marks that you're getting allocated for it. You should do that with all assignments. Have a look at how you're going to be marked, because no point spending lots and lots of time in one section of the assignment if it's only worth 5 marks as opposed to another section of the assignment, like step 8, which is worth 17 marks. Okay, so I don't think step 9 will be your doozy. Step 9 is quite straightforward. If you go to the actual marks that are allocated for step 9, which is right near the end of the assignment, you'll see what I just said. You get 5 marks, you get 1 mark for developing that capital decision for your firm, you get 3 marks for calculating, which I'll show you how to do in Excel. And literally, once you've created, this will take you the longest time, once you've created your scenario, calculating it will probably take you 15 minutes. Excel has formulas for you. Just link it all and hit enter. That's it. That calculation's done, all those calculations. And recommendation discussion, this may take you a long time too. And that's just worth 1 mark. Okay, and we do actually require quite a bit in that. So that's your 5 marks there. So look at all of your steps in light of the amount of recommended time you spend on it versus the amount of marks that you get as well. Now, Martin also has, I cover all this in the video, so you don't need to worry. This is just repeating what's in the step-by-step video on Moodle. Martin's given you his example of Ryman Healthcare's capital investment scenario as the appendix. Make sure you don't use this as your example. We don't want you to copy what Martin's done. I do this. I show you my example in the video. So I base my example on the same structure that Martin has covered in this example, and I just show you how to do the calculations in Excel and evaluate it from there. So you've got examples to follow as well for step 9. So hopefully, coming back to your comment, hopefully step 9 won't be a doozy, okay? All right. Net present value is the preferred decision criterion item over internal rate of return, as it has fewer flaws, whereas internal rate of return does not take all cash flows into account and cannot differentiate between mutually exclusive projects. However, both of these, along with the payback period, should be used when calculating the most desirable investment. Very good. That's a great thing to have learnt today, and that's a really good explanation, so well done. Net present value is one of the most effective methods in mutually exclusive projects. While internal rate of return doesn't determine which project to accept or reject, also the net present value formula. Well, internal rate of return, it doesn't determine it in mutually exclusive projects. Sorry, I thought you were just saying that as a standalone, because internal rate of return does help you to determine which project you should accept or reject. But yeah, you're right, not with mutually exclusive projects. So yeah, good. I learned that I still don't really understand what internal rate of return or net present value are. Very good. That's a good, honest comment. Do you know what? The first time I was introduced to those concepts, I still didn't understand it. And do you know what? Even after I finished my accounting degree, I still didn't understand those concepts. Isn't that terrible? Don't tell anyone. I actually learnt, the first time I truly started to understand these concepts was when I actually had to do it in practice. And I can't remember. I think one of my clients brought something to me and had net present value on it. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm pretty sure I heard that concept somewhere in my uni degree. I had no idea. Yet I'd done business finance and I'm pretty sure I got a HD for it. So it's okay that you still don't really understand what they are. What we're trying to do is give you an introduction to them. Okay, this is called our unit really is an introduction to accounting, and we don't just focus on accounting, we focus on learning, and we also focus on online communication. So our unit really is not designed to make you masters at internal rate of return or net present value or any other of the other techniques. It's really to introduce you to a concept and then let you take that as far as you want to. So it's great that you have identified that you still don't really understand it, and you know what? That's fantastic, because that means you're being honest. And that's a really good first step. You might like to spend a little bit more time now making that more personal. And the best way you can do that, well, my opinion, is to apply it to your own, some of your own personal circumstances. That's sort of why we ask you to relate all of those key concepts and questions in your step 5s and step 6s, step 1s and step 2s of your assignment to your own personal experiences. So, for example, if you're about to buy a car, or you're thinking about buying a house, or you'd like to invest in a local fish and chip shop business, or whatever it is, apply that to it. So go through, say, all right, I would like to buy, the local franchise for this. So let's have a look and see how much money this is going to make in the future based on their current financials. Usually businesses for sale will have available, or you'll have to contact the selling agent for current set of financial statements, and they'll show you, revenues and expenses essentially. And you can try and forecast future cash flows and then apply net present value, internal rate of return, payback period, all those sorts of things to that potential purchase. Okay, could just be hypothetical or could be a real decision. Net present value and internal rate of return probably aren't the best to apply to things like depreciating assets, such as cars. They don't really return you. And again, this is sort of bordering on the financial side rather than it's leaving the accounting area. Especially if you read books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, where, your house that you live in is not considered an asset, it's a liability. So assets being something that return you money in the future. But I have seen students apply it in the fact that, for example, a car, so the future cash flows of an investment in a car, is the savings in transport costs. So they might apply it to something, for example, using a taxi. So if we didn't have a car, what would be the alternative method? Those are the future cash flows that I'm saving in the future, and then you can still apply net present value. So if you can find something to apply these techniques to, I find that's when you can start to really understand how they work. Making it personal is when you understand how something works. So that's a good point. Thank you for sharing that, being honest. I think that the payback period calculations were what really stood out to me today. I liked seeing how net present value was fully broken down in a way that made sense to me and that I could easily follow. Oh, that's good. I'm very glad. I know I used a very simple example, very obvious one, but it's for that point. And interesting that you thought the payback period calculations were what really stood out. A lot of students actually don't even remember that I even discussed payback period, and would you believe we get some assignments in that have no calculation for payback period. So it's one that is actually missed a lot. I don't know why, maybe because it's the first one I go through and everyone forgets it. So that's really nice that you thought the payback periods were what stood out. Capital investment is a broad range of categories. It includes land and buildings, construction, landscaping, improvements, maintenance, furniture and fixtures, infrastructure, machines, computing, vehicles, software development, software purchases, business acquisitions, branding, and intellectual property. I found this website to be helpful with generating ideas. Oh, fantastic. This is good if anyone is sort of struggling with creating a capital investment scenario. There's a nice link there that you can follow, but that's very good in terms of researching or using your resources to help you to come up with scenarios for your company. We do want it to be related to your company, so you have to think about how this scenario can relate to your company. But you're right, capital investment is anything that you want to invest your capital into, and there are so many different things we can invest our capital into. Some things really probably aren't investments, but there is a broad range, a wide variety of things that we can choose to park our money into in the hope that we get something in return. So for your scenarios that you have to create anything, so you look at your company and you think, just create a scenario for any one of their products or services, or their future stores that they might want to open, or future research and development that they might want to consider. Remember, it doesn't have to be your parent company. Remember, your company often owns a number of subsidiary companies, and I explained that in the capital budgeting video. You can just choose a scenario based on one of the subsidiary companies' businesses. And that's what I do for Wesfarmers, actually. So when you're considering what on earth, how do I create this scenario? Just remember, your company has a number of other businesses it owns, so you've got such a wide range of businesses to look at, and those businesses have such a broad range of investments available to put their capital into. And you just need to come up with one and guesstimate your figures. Okay, like I did for the Wesfarmers scenario. All right, very good. Let's move on to some of the questions. What questions do you still have that are unanswered? I can never think of them on the spot. That's all right. That's what our tutorials are for anyway. This is completely unrelated to today's lesson, but when I was watching your videos for the contribution margins, I think, the other day, and I noticed that you had these prices for the variable costs. Where do you get the variable costs from? Okay, so this is to do with step 7, calculating your contribution margin, which again is only worth a few marks, so keep that in perspective. You estimate them is the short answer. Where I got my variable costs from, I used a percentage figure. So I got because in my scenario, I could actually obtain the real selling prices. Now, and I explained this in the video, if you can't obtain the real selling prices, that's okay. You just guesstimate those selling prices, okay? Your best guess is fine. We don't get too hung up on selling price and variable cost. As long as you get them, generally reasonable, we are focused on what you do with them, i.e. how you calculate that contribution margin, okay? So, and the most marks are for calculating contribution margin and explaining it to us. So really, we don't really care. I mean, we do care, but we don't put much emphasis on how accurate your sales price and your variable costs are. In my example that I show you in the video, I actually was able to get the real sales price for my 3 products. And my variable cost figure, I used a percentage of those real sale costs. I think it was 90%. So that's where I got my variable costs from. Okay, you don't have to use a percentage. You can just say, I think a reasonable variable cost might be, and come up with a figure. The idea is then, what are you doing with those sales and variable costs? Show us that you know that a contribution margin is calculated by sales price minus variable cost. Show us that you understand that a contribution margin is contributing to more than just the fixed costs, hopefully profits, and show us your understanding of why they might vary between products. And that's what we're really focused on in your assignment. So hopefully that answered where I got my variable costs from though. I literally used a percentage and just based them on my real sales prices, because I was lucky enough to be able to get those real sales prices. How long will it take my peer-wise score to get to 6,000? That's a Martin question. Do you want to comment on that one, Martin? Martin's the peer-wise guru. He gives tips, actually. He's got a blog and he's got an entire page on his blog dedicated to getting your score up quickly. On peer-wise
questions. Sorry? The more questions you ask on peer-wise, and then the more you comment on other students' questions and they comment on yours, is how your score increases faster.
That's right. That's spot on. So, and the more quality questions you write, that other people realise that they're quality questions and rate them as quality questions. So it's all about interaction, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
I can.
I've just tried this. I'm having a bit of trouble with the mic, but Yeah. Is the question how to get a high PY score?
How to get it quickly?
Quickly. Well, it's a bit late now. A lot of things in this unit we've designed that it doesn't pay the back end. Yeah, that can work quite well in a lot of situations, including certain assignments at uni and other tasks at work and stuff. But we've designed it that you've got to work steadily through the term. So that's what gets you the mark in PYs, because there's only 1 mark left. It's only 5 anyway, and so there's 4 already gone. So there's only 1 mark left. And if you've got way behind, but if you haven't been using PYs at all, it's certainly possible to get a few, get 0.2 or even 0.4 in the, Paul Denny, who designed PYs and runs it out of Auckland Uni, he's never told me how the formula works, it's a trade secret how he calculates the score in the top corner. But what he has said is that they're multiplicative. So you've got to write questions, answer questions, and comment on questions, comment and rate questions. You've got to do a bit of everything. If you only answer questions, you won't get much of a score because they're multiplying the different elements in this formula. So you should write a few questions. And I suggest in the advice on PYs to think of answering about 10 times as many questions as you write, something like that, and then comment and rate questions as you answer them. And the other big tip I give on PYs, which is completely useless now, is you start early. That is the big tip on PYs. So if you find yourself using PYs in a later unit, we use it in a few of the accounting units, core accounting units, start early. That's the trick. I always personally do very well in PYs because I start early. Does that help a little bit? The other thing with PYs is it's quite easy to get a low score, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, and most people get 0.6 to 0.8 each week, and some people get 1, some people get less. And if you get 0.6 or 0.8 over 5, that's sort of 3 or 4. So a lot of people get 3 to 4 out of 5 for PYs. A few people, not that many, but a few people manage to get 5 or 4.5 or something if they get a few 1s and 0.8s. So you can get, but the other thing is to remember it's low, there's only 5 marks. So most people get 3 to 4. It's not a high take assessment. You get some marks for doing it, but what separates students are the assignments. They're worth 95%. And that's what separates students. And so that's what you should focus on. Does that help at all?
I think that's fantastic, Martin. Martin always does very well on PYs because he's usually the first person in there.
You know how to do well on PYs. Start earlier. Write good quality questions, and then people will follow you. And then when you put questions up later on, you've got all these people who answer them. Can't go wrong, really, can you?
That's great. Thanks, Martin. Okay, so hopefully that's answered the PYs question. Pop more questions up if it didn't. Okay, so last question. Actually, looks like there's 2 questions. Can we be certain that the dollar value will increase in the future? Well, it won't. That's the whole point of the time value of money. A dollar value doesn't increase. It goes down. That's why that's why dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow, because the dollar today is worth more. The dollar's not increasing, the dollar's decreasing. Actually, this is a question, if my hubby was here, he would talk your ear off about this, okay? He's a big believer in the gold standard, so he's not very trusting in this fiat system. But a dollar doesn't increase in the future, it decreases. The value of money is decreasing. If you hold $100,000 cash in your bank today and you think you're going to have the buying power of that $100,000 in 5 years, you can think again, okay? That's why that's why you require interest, because you require some compensation for the fact that your $100,000 isn't going to be $100,000 in the future. Yeah, it might look on paper it's $100,000, but the buying power of that $100,000 will not be $100,000, it'll be less. Okay, and that's to do with many, many factors. One being inflation, the fact that prices, wages, the cost of living, et cetera, all those fancy terms you hear thrown around in the media, increase. Everybody always wants pay rises. So therefore, the cost of the goods go up and blah, blah. And so the buying power of your money is decreasing. It's a very interesting concept, and one that most people are very interested in. Like I said, my hubby's a tradesman. He wouldn't know how to account to save himself, but he can tell you he understands how the economies work and how the values of currencies work and how the fiat system works. So, and a lot of people are very interested in those sorts of things. So can we be certain that the dollar value will increase? No, you can't be. You can almost be certain it will decrease, but none of us have a crystal ball either. So how can we plan around uncertainties such as global pandemics? Yes, the global pandemic. That can affect the Australian dollar value. Oh, look, there are so many things, again, that can affect our Australian dollar value. And even purchasing things that hopefully hedge our buying powers, like your precious metals, they're listed in US dollars. You buy them in US dollars. So the fact that we're in Australian dollars and the Australian dollar fluctuates, but we have to buy things to try and hedge our buying power in foreign currency dollars, affects the value of our investments, essentially. So if you could tell me how to plan around uncertainties such as global pandemics, I think you'd be a fairly rich person. None of us have a crystal ball. Martin, do you want to comment on that very interesting, insightful question? How can we plan around uncertainties? I say you can't plan. I say you just do the best with your understanding and your resources that you have.
How can we plan around uncertainties? Well, we do. Everything's uncertain about the future. In terms of investing, a certain proportion of people studying business are interested in investing, and that's what I've done through my working life. And to get rich investing, you just have to do one thing, and that is to get the risk-return relationship in your favour. So that means that there are risks out there, but if you can, and you get a return the more risk you take and so forth. But if you can get extra return for the amount of risk you're taking, or take less risk to get a return, you'll make money over time, because there are unders and overs with the risks, and over time it's sort of like, I use this example in the study guide. When I first came across these poker machines and so forth in hotels years ago, and the guys would say in these pubs, and they was coming in, they'd say, it's fantastic, we just open the back of them on a Thursday or whatever, and now all this money comes out, close it up again, and you just empty it again, just all this money. Why is that? It's because in those poker machines, they've got them set so that the house wins over time. So it might take 70% out of it, and they give back 30%. So if you keep playing the poker machines, you'll lose your money, but the owners will make money. And that's a bit like getting the risk-return relationship in your favour. Businesses and so forth are not poker machines. You're not got the whole thing like that. But if you can understand how to do that, and that's where the fundamental analysis comes in, and being able to analyse firms. If you can do that, you can manage the risks. The other thing is to keep a bit of cash. I always keep some cash, access to cash, and that can help you when things go wrong, both in your personal life, but also in investing, and you can take some opportunities. Ryman Healthcare, it was trading around, I think around $15 a share before the crash, before the COVID-19, something like that. It went to $6.60 one day. Now there was a day. I have a view on its value. Man, $6.60, you're not going to go too wrong by that price. It was just the day, and then it's been down around 11 and 10 and $9 as well, different times. And then it's back up. The share market's partly recovered generally. I think Ryman's is around $12. So you can get a few little opportunities sometimes. And the other thing with the COVID-19, with these pandemics, with major financial crashes like the one we're going through, this will go on for a few years. So there's often not a great rush to invest either. You can take your time, see what's going to happen. Next couple of years it's going to be pretty wild, and it's unclear how the economies of different countries of the world are going to go. Did I answer that question?
Fantastic.
Is uncertain. The world's full of people who tell me, oh, wouldn't it be good investing in something, say Ryman Healthcare back in 1999, 20 years ago. And they say that now. Well, that's no good. You've got to decide at the time. You've got to decide in advance. You've got to be able to make judgments, be able to think for yourself, process information, and make judgments about an uncertain future. And if you can do that better than average, that's all you have to be, better than average, get rich over time. That's me. I'll stop there.
That's me too, Martin. I'm done. I'm done for the day. So thank you, everyone. We've had some good discussions today, and I'll leave you to your tutorial session now, I suppose.